wanted to start?
The perfect way to start is to impose a kind of embarrassing silence to heighten everybody's guilt about well, we better say what we think. Okay, well then you were right. We have an unguilty person on the right here, and I hope there were some more.
Well, if I'm not too unpopular on that, actually, I would like to bring back the debate of where it was before lunch, because I think that we left it on a couple of issues which I think are rather important to what we have been doing for the last 2 days. And if it is possible, to tie it up with discussion on this afternoon, which in a way has been done. I think that from my point of view, I found it quite exciting that somehow we were propelled within those 2 days from issues of theoretical and philosophical nature into issue of the problem of internationality in contemporary office building, which is completely technology dependent, and therefore this is not a problem. What are you talking about? It is interesting methodologically that we as a group are in this setting doing this, because obviously it raises issue in this discussion on how do we approach the different contributions in those 2 days and how we assess them. It's obvious that we might have some agreement and disagreement on specific points and contentions that we have had on the Verda or on the significance of fascist window symbolism. But if the issue is nationality and internationality, I would like to suggest a couple of themes for discussion. One theme is that it is an issue which is historically loaded. One of the things that actually has worried me a little bit throughout the debate, especially perhaps in the first day, because probably I did not control historical references as well, but that some references were made on this issue from all times and all historical and geographical context. So one heard words like international Gothic, and then one heard words like MoMA exhibition, MoMA exhibition, and first time in the 13th. So it seems to me that in order to have a fruitful discussion, we ought actually to limit the historical setting within and therefore the cultural references, the temporal setting, and therefore the chronological setting, and therefore the historical references that we bring in and out of the discussion. The second point that came out for me from this morning's discussion is that certain strategies of cultural history, which are particularly perceptive on issues of compositional matters, seems to me fruitful in indicating the area of ambiguity on which the issue of nationalism and internationalism some issues could lie. And it seems to me that then we were propelled into a situation in which suddenly that discussion that was happening in the morning and on which, for example, I would be very interested when I wear my hat of historian into finding what is the exact historiographical attitude, the exact methodology, and how we enter into it, was somehow shattered and provocatively so by Don's contribution when he said, all right, fine, but I'm not after buildings. Now, okay, so how do we place that contribution, which is provocative and interesting and challenging within the debate. And then another even shattering, from a methodological point of view, conclusion which says, yes, but if you are, after all, interested about buildings, that is what you have been discussing somehow for the previous day and a half, then you're interested in methodological and historiographical and cultural approaches and bringing the philosophy into it in order to highlight things with this. Nowadays, the most important constituent of the urban context and of architecture, the office building, well, those issues are not really what you're after. Therefore, if you're talking about not the future, but you're talking about now, you've got to revise a certain parameters. And what are the parameters now? So I think that with the range, the fun that for me would be important in this discussion is, at the first level, to determine the historical, chronological context from which we're drawing, at the second level, to draw some attention to methodological issues. And here I suspect that people that know better handle of philosophical and theoretical points might want to draw attention to certain things. And the third is that there is a pressing contemporary architectural context that somehow, I think, challenges the validity of all of that.
Okay, then on that, using some of those issues, would anybody like to respond? I'm quite happy to make a comment, since I think that perhaps the question that Don raises, I think, might be one that you could get at the subject with, and that is that the architect often isn't only about buildings. His culture is not only concerned with buildings. He is concerned with ideas about buildings. But there are always ideas about buildings even without him, as a point which you yourself made. So the point is, buildings always do have ideas behind them. But I think another question where we might in fact draw in even the office building is that although there are ideas behind buildings, there are also different sorts of thoughts about buildings, and the office building is one such example of a very complex present state which this person we are particularly interested in, because we belong to this discipline called architect, can be seen as playing a part, and in some ways, as Frank Duffy showed us, a somewhat marginalized part. He's only one of those people, not enormously marginalized, but sometimes marginalized, depending on the pressure of the system. But architecture is always like that. I mean, there always have been people who, there always has been the discipline of the thinking about architecture discipline, which in the whole of history has always been playing different roles. And one of those roles might be the exploration of what it should be thinking about, which is the sort of thing that I think Don was talking about. At some particular time in history, architects don't necessarily have to concentrate all their attention and all their thoughts on actually building. They can actually think about what building should be about. They can think of their own utopias. Their culture includes a much richer agenda than it would have been in our old vernacular making period. I mean, that's one thing. I do think these things fit together into a haven't mentioned the topic of nationalism or nationality, because all those things even impinge on that in different ways. But I do think one can tie some of those things together. Yeah.
Well, I mean, one of the things I was trying to suggest is that those differentiations that you were mentioning in the very last phrases, that at certain times architects thought more about this, and at certain times thought more about just building, or perhaps chose not to build. I wouldn't make those differentiations. I think that all of that occurs simultaneously at all times. And what I'm trying to elevate, and this is even particularly true in the presentation on office buildings, is that within the process, complex process that goes into making any artifact, from the smallest to the largest, that there are also a whole set of other categories of desires and beliefs that are operating simultaneously, but which are excluded from the discussion. And so that even in the categories of the slides that were shown about what it is that motivates and determines somehow the present state of what office construction is at, I think that there is also an encyclopedia of other excluded determinants, and that it's the hierarchy that's usually given to these different determinations that somehow continues to be dismissive of a certain other category, and that's the morality that I was insisting upon. And so that when there's a discussion about the difference between a Scandinavian office and an American office, there was a suggestion made that the reason the American offices are so open is because Americans somehow like to be, they don't have any anxiety towards corporate structure, whereas in Scandinavia there's some sort of anxiety towards the corporate identity. I think that, in one sense, that very much misses the impositional aspect of corporation, and therefore doesn't begin to suggest the complexity at which the cultures themselves are organized around politically, economically, and psychically, and therefore, that then to draw it into a further discussion, which is why I said I'm interested in building, but I'm not interested in the hierarchy that building is the pinnacle of an architectural practice in the largest sense, is that these relationships back to the architects are always misleading, in that there's some sort of directly demonstrable consequential action between a whole set of values, which first of all are always talked about in a very limited way, so therefore they're not really talking about it in the way that it exists, and that they could somehow, by that, even so, they could somehow still find some reason why something became the way it became.
Well, the only thing I just quickly respond back to you about is that what you later alleged and what you first alleged, that I said, it wasn't quite. I didn't quite agree with what you thought I said. But you may be right. That's how I came across to you. But I in fact would agree with the second part of your statements about this complexity and about all the different roles. All I was saying, in fact, was that under certain very simplistic conditions, you don't have the same sort of roles. The role changes. And I do think that's what Frank Duffy was saying, that the is he here? Is Frank gone? Yeah. What he was saying was that the role, in fact, the role changes, as in fact the culture, the impingement of the culture changes, and in different places one does find different reactions. I mean, that's at a very crude level. So I mean, I think we've got to get the whole kind of language of all these multiple parts a little bit straight. Otherwise, the subject gets very difficult to talk about. I mean, not only, and the present is probably the most complex of all times. Perhaps not, but it's just the one that surrounds us. Maybe we're being reductive about all other times. I rather think that really is the case. But we actually can see the present in all its complexity. A little criticism I sometimes feel about Foucault's episteme, that he doesn't like to see the present, he rather feels that one can look at the past in a more interesting way because one's outside it. But there's also the notion that one can actually look at the present in a degree of fullness that you can't ever look at the past, because one actually has got so much complexity around you in trying to handle it, which of course you cannot even detect when you look even 20 years ago. I mean, I just see that as a sort of paradoxical situation even in the Foucaultian argument. Sorry, don't want to get Mark into great response on Foucault. I mean,
I was going to say Foucault lived, but he's dead. I mean, one of the things that I think there's a slight danger in the discussion, which is there seems to be two sorts of discussions which might be had, and perhaps it's necessary slightly to separate them. On the one hand, there's been a lot of material presented in the last few days about, for example, projects to make architectural forms so-called express national values or whatever. Also, there's been quite a lot of materials presented about movements either, in some sense, to make architecture an international language, or in some sense to even take up a kind of internationalist position. Now, both those issues, it seems to me, raise a number of interesting, but in some sense quite straightforward, set of problems for cultural and historical analysis. On the other hand, there's like a discussion, and perhaps it would make more sense to have this discussion second, which was about what is actually entailed, for example, in even ever thinking that the nation could be expressed in architectural form, which is really, in a sense, a subsection of a question which always is the question that these conferences return to. Like, in what sense does it make sense to talk of architectural forms of having a meaning, for example? Attached to that, I think, was the concern in some of the papers also to address the issue of the way in which architectural and national metaphors, perhaps about boundaries, walls, frontiers, whatever, they interestingly contaminate each other, and perhaps one wants to kind of think, in what sense does the nation or the concept of a building imply a certain kind of topology, in which case the question to ask is what is the relationship of that topology to some sort of psychic experience and some sort of theoretical problem in actually being able to describe that. So I think there are different discussions to have. In a sense, my proposal would be that Mika's discussion, might be the one to have first about the sort of historical materials, the question of the analysis of projects for national and international forms might be discussed first, and then I think they might lead in at the end to the other questions. So it's just a sort of suggestion. Otherwise, I think we run the risk of discussing the issue at different levels at the same moment.
But don't you think somebody should raise the issue? Probably a good chairman, yeah.
Well, could I raise what I think in a fairly straightforward way, the methodological issues that were raised by the papers in different ways about the issue of the representation of the nation in architectural form? It seems to me there was in effect, although it was never clearly stated, a kind of methodological consensus was emerging during the conference, which is that no one, interestingly enough, ever took the position that such a thing as a nation could ever be represented in architectural form. But on the other hand, there was an obsessive level of history of attempting to do just that. So while it's quite impossible in any kind of logical or theoretical sense. Nonetheless, it has been an important project in architectural construction, and has often been like a very successful meaning taken at the level of its reception. So that we're in the paradoxical position methodologically of saying there's absolutely no way, in fact, a nation, whatever that might be, could ever be expressed in architectural form. The problem is that everyone thinks that there can be. I mean, I think in a sense that in turn is linked to an important problem about the nation itself. Clearly, as it were, most people think of a nation as having a definite identity in some form or other. At the same time, I think there was a certain kind of consensus, was that in a logical sense there simply was no such thing as a nation. Or rather, the means whereby a nation existed have a peculiar imaginary form. By imaginary, I don't mean not really existing. I mean that the process whereby a nation exists takes place at the level of the way in which the people identify with images of the nation. In that sense, the existence of a nation is dependent on a kind of process of identification. It's not, as it were, an identity. There's no kind of eternal natural object called being British. There are a mobile kind of system of identifications which will change and which people identify with. Amongst those images will be architectural images. I think that. I mean, that's,
but would you? Sorry.
No,
go.
So I just came off from that. But among those images will be architectural images. That is an extraordinarily downward slope. I mean, I can't imagine a conference such as this being held in another 10 years with architecture at the end of the title, unless it was entirely historians. I mean, I think does so in his flash way, sort of in talking about television and images and people with the whole business. I can remember comics when everything was compared either with the weight of the pyramids, the height of Nelson's column, or the length of the Queen Elizabeth, a bit of waterborne architecture.
You mean the ship?
Yes, I mean, there's the bigger comics to the other one. No. But the last sort of visual image that I remember being used in such comparisons in children's comics was in fact the very first big, sort of, I can't remember the name, the very first big American rocket, which no one would ever see because it had gone, not one carrying it on its back. The first big one, Saturn or whatever it was. Now, that sort of imagery, even if only in comparison, is moving out of architecture, even as Duncan said, to pop stars, magazine covers, things like that. So if in fact, in nationalism and internationalism, if that is the subject, then the discussion, having said in architecture, the discussion is about the diminution of architecture's role in that, but not necessarily exploring as I say, I think it was usually recognized when it was over, the act. And therefore, it makes this particular gathering even more relevant because it might put something like it might be able to chart in a cultural way the angle of decline or the angle of deceleration of architecture and its role in establishing nationalism and internationalism in a way that Duffy had introduced it, because primarily it was talking about change in work styles which happen to be in architecture at the moment.
I mean, I think there are several points about that. I mean, one is certainly that, like, images, for example, what it is to be British and what the measurements of that certainly are changing. I mean, the examples you gave, like how things are weighed, in terms of English objects. I certainly remember at the age of 11 in the children's newspaper, they had the following points. They said, questions that all boys and girls want to know the answer to. Why does it get dark at night? When was the Boy Scout movement founded? And the third one was, is there an English lady mentioned in the Bible? The odd thing was that the answer was yes.
Who?
Now, well, since we're here, it's someone called Jamila.
But I mean, I'm interested in the relationship. I agree with you, but the relationship I feel there's been some very worthy but extraordinarily convoluted and tenuous efforts to bring architecture back into some sort of record of change and identity in manners, behavior, and other sort of public and national mores.
But surely at the point of like the way in which architectural images will in 10 years define certain Englishness is indeed precisely through the return of the past. The way in which those historical buildings which are already identified as being British and to be preserved or whatever, their effect will intensify. In that sense, I would have thought I don't know what a new British architecture...
But the problem of identification is more complicated than that, because the identification may be for those images, but it may also be a negative identification against those images and facing other problems. I mean, a lot of the issues, a lot of things have been discussed this afternoon about what the images might be, and it need not necessarily be historical. Because I mean, the main problem is of the whole of any kind of creative activity is that originality plays a very major part and has done in the whole of the 20th century and a certain amount of the whole of history. And one of the key things about the 20th century and particularly about modernism was its rather odd attitude. Not always a correct attitude. I mean, it wasn't always correct in its own analysis of itself about the role of the past. I mean, it has tended not to take much interest in it, or else discredit it, or else ignore it, while at the same time, not being able to ignore it. So it's had an ambivalence, and of course that ambivalence, I think, there's no sense in which that ambivalence has totally disappeared. There is a sense in the sort of, in a way in which a kind of populist taste has come and is having its little attack both within the architectural profession and from outside the architectural profession, and saying all you guys must get a lot more populist, led by our dear Prince. But that's not necessarily the way anything's going. I mean, there is still that very serious ambivalence, which I think is probably once that awareness has been found, it cannot be lost again as to the role in which newness, inventiveness, the assimilation of the unknown, or the assimilation of those things that one aspires to, and not just pure historical images anymore. I mean, there's a totally different role, I think, of images, and I think that once the 20th century had started, that whole image system broke down.
So, Cedric and then
Yes. Very, very quickly, the business about the images of the past, in so much the concern with retaining them is the concern with recognizable stability. Now, and the recognizable stability of the institutions that they house. Now, what is interesting with Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank and Lloyd's is that the very latest architecture is being used to bolster up traditions that are under question. Lloyd's was never more under question it's telling China in advance, look, we do it this way. We've got the 19th century ethic of hard work, 9 to 5, and we have 25 floors of pen pushers, you know, keeping the accounts, and we need them collectively because we are a stable bank. And therefore, to show that they're not an old-fashioned bank, they don't find an old building, show that stability of an old-time institution, whether it was Lloyd's, you know, and the Secret Office, or whether Tom will check my bank out of the business of well-ordered people under a corporate head. Yet, we are progressive enough to have the finest, newest buildings in the world. That's how strong our old-fashioned institutions are.
I mean,
so
I think
there's a reversal of the use of architecture in that way.
I mean, I think that's right, and the conclusion to that, in a sense, is that we're beginning to lose the political will to destroy buildings, which is actually a very great political problem. So, Mika.
Well, one of the things I was suggesting in my introduction to get the ball rolling was that I think that the issue of nationalism and internationalism is both in historiographical and in real historical terms a fundamental issue at the beginning of the century. That is, in an issue that as historian we have to take into account, and because the producer took it into account, and we saw it in certain delicate context, how important was and how tight the rope that they walked, I'm quoting Carol, was. I'm also suggesting that, if I can paraphrase David Dunster, that one of his categories for internationalism now was that professional expertise are, he used international, I would say transnational. We are a group of people of which there is an American talking about Italian architecture in the 20s, a Basque gentleman talking about Plechny, you know, I can go on, but the example is obvious. And we are the Architectural Association in London, and each of us can, if we want, work on an IBM, bling, 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 key in whatever we want if we don't use our data because we don't back up. Okay? Now, this is the issue of today's life. For us, the issue of nationalism and internationalism is neither historically important or as a historian or as an architect fundamental for our work. Something has culturally substantially changed.
The earlier discussion about the symbolization of nationality was that the two examples I can think of, I mean, I was actually trying to think of national symbols, and apart from the koala bear, which I'm told is so stinky you wouldn't pick one up, and the sort of the maple leaf of Canada, I really couldn't think of them. But two things came very quickly to mind. One was the Eiffel Tower, and the other was the Sydney Opera House. The historic, you know, their own history I find quite interesting. Marjorie Perloff in The Futurist Moment goes on about, or tells a story about how, you know, when did it become called the Eiffel Tower? Because it was hated, according to her, when it was first constructed. And the first person to paint it was Delaunay. And Delaunay took a terribly long time to paint this painting, as far as I've seen. And then numerous, I don't know how many examples there are of painting the Eiffel Tower in order to convey something about it that interested him. Of course, he then visited Eiffel and was so depressed because Eiffel was surrounded not by modern things but by Victorian clutter. The second image, the Sydney Opera House, is also in a way a story of a kind of emergent city, if you like, suddenly discovering its symbol, despite the fact that at some levels they never wanted the opera house but thought they ought to have culture. Despite the fact that they sacked the architect. You know, will it be known as the Utzon Opera House in the way that the Eiffel Tower has become the Eiffel Tower, which it was not always called, and is funded by a lottery. It seems to me that it's, and still is, it seems to me that the kind of symbolization, the processes of symbolization, what I was going to come round to saying was that the processes of symbolization which occur in terms of identity national, but at any rate at particular urban levels, generally has to go through the name. It has to go through the name of somebody. And of course, if you think about it, Sydney Opera House is pretty close to that, because a lot of people call Sydney.
Frankie Ford was the first concert there.
I wasn't there, Cedric. What was it like?
Well, I know, but I just imagine what it before. But they liked the Sydney Opera House while it was building. I mean, that always occurred to me that they should never have finished building it, because the tours were a great success and very popular. And they told you how much the piece of Italian marble and how heavy it was swinging over your head. Perhaps continuous. London may be doing in Canary Wharf. I shouldn't think those two sort of careful galoshes Canadians are too pleased about the idea of actually having to let the space. They spend long enough commissioning more and more grand buildings, and we go down on trips on that big time forever. Maybe that's a symbol of city. But the only living city is the one that's still growing and changing itself. The dead city is the one that looks perfect, like Sydney.
Thank you. Jeff and then Julia.
I just wanted to say, I mean, the sort of symbol that Larry's invoking seems to me to be positively different from the sort of thing that's been at issue in a number of the papers talking about the possibility of a national style. I mean, I think the Eiffel Tower is in some significant sense perhaps in the status of a mascot, perhaps, or a logo or something like that. I mean, it's not, I think, perceived as exemplary of a French style of architecture any more than the Sydney Opera House. I think it would be perceived as something that could be thought of as an Australian style of architecture. It seems to be a slightly different relationship. And I think, in a sense, those objects work rather better because of a sort of slightly arbitrary link between them and the place they come to symbolise. I mean, I don't think, this is coming back to Mark's point about expression, I don't think people would say that Sydney Opera House expresses a sort of Australianness, and the Eiffel Tower doesn't really express a Frenchness. I don't think that's how those things work. And I wanted to link that to the problem that seems to me to be the root of both why there's a historical problem and also why it's a logical possibility, as Mark said. And that's that as soon as these things come to be thought of in terms of style, the problem with style is that it's imitable and pasticheable. And somewhere everybody knows that that style somehow announcing its finishedness or Englishness or something is phony because it's imitating a style. And that phoniness seems to me to be built into the notion of identification, which Mark was invoking, and gives rise to this complicated situation where, in a sense, the closer the identification gets to producing identity, the phonier it is. And this would be behind what Stefan quoted, a very interesting example of Elgar this morning, that Elgar is sort of the most English of English, but in a sense absolutely phony in that respect, because he's so close to what it would be to English. And there'd be things to say about Stefan's notion of the home and Freud's notion of Heimlich and Unheimlich, and the notion of the uncanny, which is often a mirror image or a double that's so close to being identity that it's absolutely unidentical. In fact, in a sense, the closer it gets to being identical, the further away it gets. And that's, I think, behind the perception of a sort of necessary failure of those types of things, but also a necessary moving on and attempts at different sorts of pickups of that. And I think probably that would eventually link to a more complicated argument, which would need to say that you can't have a simple historical take on these questions, because were it not for these questions, there would be no history, and that the relationship between nation and internation, and between identity and identification, is a question that's in some sense not something that can simply be located in history, because were it not for those movements on that the failure of identifications generate, or that the transgressions of frontiers and the very positing of frontiers generate, there would be no history at all. So in the end, it can't simply be a historic very radical problem, even though, of course, it does also have those dimensions. And I think that's the point where there would be a bridge between the two sorts of questions that Mark invoked. It does mean that they're not separable questions, but it also means that neither can sort of ignore the other.
Yeah, I think I agree with Joe. I mean, my feeling is that I also agree with Mika. I'm not happy, as I said yesterday, with the dichotomy of national and international. I'm not sure how useful it is, but I wouldn't go on from that to abandon the project of some kind of correlation of formal and identities of language or whatever it might be. I mean, I was slightly surprised actually that Jeff didn't speak up earlier. It seemed to me that what you were, as it were, invoking the possibility of right at the beginning of the conference was some kind of style, well, okay, not styles, but forms or some things with boundaries around. And to abandon the project entirely, I think, would be a shame. I mean, my feeling is that I would have liked to see more discussion, I suppose, around the opposition between the sort of ethnic, although, I mean, in terms of the things that we've seen, whether Finnish or German or whatever, the sort of folkish, the kind of people or linguistic or some identity of that kind. That identities and frontiers and whatever has been generated there, and I think there may well be some. I mean, I would have. I mean, I liked the comment, for example, about Valhalla. I also, I mean, nobody picked it up, but this is about the Gothic being spiritual, which is one of the things that Voringer talks about. The expression is rather keen on. I mean, what does that mean? But there is an aspect here, I think, which could have been thought about on the Finnish question. I mean, the whole appropriation of wood as a sort of as totemic object. So I mean, that was something which struck me personally. I thought the sort of in the comments on Plečnik in the public library, I mean, the business about the interrelation between the brick and the stone, and the way I wasn't quite sure the force of the argument, but the sense in which the stone is dissolved into brick, and I mean the relationship between the two, precisely what the symbolization is supposed to be. I wasn't quite sure what the force of the argument was, but it seemed to me an extremely interesting play with possibilities of I don't know, frontiers between vocabularies of some sort or another. I mean, there's this kind of language, or there's the play with forms or symbols or linguistic patterns on one side, and then on the other side there are the other things that we've been looking at. I mean, the kind of what has been called international, or the international dictates of IBM, or whoever it might be. Which, again, I mean, maybe international is not necessarily the right term, but it's clearly something very different from what people like Haddo are trying to explore. I mean, Hegel says words to the effect that the Enlightenment forces its enemies to adopt weapons that it, that is, Enlightenment itself, chooses. Sorry, that's a rather inadequate paraphrase, I can't remember the exact sentence. But, I mean, the point about Enlightenment, as it were, the rationality which attempts to disperse the more primitive identities, or perhaps the more satisfactory identities, forces its enemy to adopt its own weapons. As to say, it forces it to build workstations which can incorporate computers, and it forces it to do this and the other. And I don't think that modern office buildings are really any different from, as it were, old-fashioned office buildings in that respect. I mean, they're just maximization of the output of the people who work in them. I don't know. I mean, those are very general terms. Seems to me in some ways a more illuminating contrast than the contrast typically between nationality and internationality, because I think terms like nationality are already to differentiate in their own realm of application to be transferred to architecture. And I think, I mean, personally, I'm slightly disappointed at the fact that, as I would understand it, some of the extremely interesting materials that have been brought up haven't, as it were, been free to be discussed in those terms. I think there's been a sort of inhibition, which I feel has been introduced by this concept of nationality. I'm allowed to say that because I'm over here, and the people who thought that was like for it.
Well, actually, Mark was the person who must be known. Wait a minute,
Don't say any more.
No, Mark was the person who it must be known initiated the idea with great hesitancy. I mean, I just want to, because in his initial statement, he sets it off as a generator, not as a kind of finite set of terms. And in fact, I think the key thing about what's been very interesting about the way in which the conversation is going, and I actually tried to reflect and feel exactly the same on this issue, is that this is a very good way into looking at the problem. And although even in all the bits that were sort of put out very initially about such a subject, there were the conditions as to how it doesn't quite work. And I mean, this was the intention of a generating argument. And actually it is rather difficult without some kind of set of concepts to get this conversation going. So I would agree with you that having got it going, it's also, one also might feel one's got to tie oneself to some of it. But I don't think many people were enormously inhibited by it, and had in fact, I personally think the areas of agreement were quite remarkable as to the difficulties that involved in the terms, which actually is how it was set up in the first place.
Sorry, so you're next. Can I just come very briefly back? I mean, yes, I suggested it because obviously the problem of the definition and the analysis of the nation is currently one which exercises all the social sciences, about which they have very little interesting to say about the nation, and clearly there are kind of external political reasons for taking up those issues again. I think that's particularly true when one's talking about the problem of the nation. I don't sense in the conference there's been a lot of problem with the notion of the nation. I think that there's been a certain kind of muddle about the term international. I mean, that is to say, people haven't separated out, in a sense, various different sorts of problems. One, the idea of architecture simply as a kind of transnational practice which produces kind of buildings that look pretty much the same. Secondly, as it were, the issue of architecture at the level of aesthetics as a deliberately internationalist project, in a sense, a thought which has been there since the 18th century, that to make aesthetic judgments is automatically to exist at a level different from the nation state, which is, as it were, always an aesthetic, a resource from aesthetics, which propels architects towards internationalism. And then there's even, like, insofar as architects historically exercise what sort of Levi-Strauss calls a timid goodwill. They're internationalist, like, because there is a level of social optimism there, which is particularly strong, I think, in the 20s and 30s. But I think all those issues are extremely different sorts of issues. And maybe we've got into something of a muddle around them. But sorry, Yehuda.
I think that I agree that it was slightly a misfortunate way of establishing the problematics. I think it would be, for example, it would be more appropriate and more in keeping with the discussion that already undergone in this field, to refer to originalism as opposed to something else, rather than nationalism. And this is indeed the kind of concept that has been used by a number of people, notably by Ken Franton. The problem there is becoming more interesting, but then it links exactly with some of the issues raised in the papers that Julian was referring to. It's a problem indeed between those who believe that the Enlightenment, or the project of the Enlightenment, is still a valid project and has to be pursued, which immediately leads to universality, which I would say is the kind of next step on the line of the more meaningful dimension of internationality where it is critical. Versus those who believe that that the project of the Enlightenment indeed is inseparable from intensification of labor, etc., and therefore is about time that we abandon it. There is no more on that way. And it seems to me that the problem with critical regionalism, as I saw it, was that indeed, insofar it is regional, national, and so on, it is not critical. And insofar it is critical, it is not regional. And I have in mind people like, for example, the example was put forward by Frampton, where people like Caesar. Or take Tade Ando. Tade Ando, a few years ago in a lecture in London, had one tea room and one church. But in the lecture here last week, he had no tea room and 5 churches, and he started the lecture with slides of the Pantheon. And he was referring constantly to Italian Renaissance as his source of inspiration. Now, whether it's true or not, it's immaterial. But my point is that that the issue that is alive at the moment, I think, is precisely around the question of whether critical architecture needs a critical regionalism in order to exist, or whether critical architecture can retain its autonomy. And the great difference between the early modern and the contemporary situation is that the early modern, insofar as they were not part of a national movement, as they were in the beginning in Finland, but no longer after, they were connected in the idea of universality with something else. Now, that idea of universality, which was really discussed, is the connecting link with the project of the Enlightenment, and it is really the essence of any kind of architecture, then or now, which can be critical in one way or another. Now, the problem is that, of course, to lead to inhibit universality or to possess universality is an uncomfortable situation. One wants to be at home, in inverted commas, and this is the sociological input that we got today. I mean, the desire to be at home is understandable, but perhaps this is the desire that has to be overcome in order to maintain the critical project. The critical project is back to the Kantian situation, but the origin of it, the Kantian origin, the Enlightenment source of it, has been somehow, I think, became rather opaque. And those who speak for it, for example, have found themselves in a kind of, in a weak position. Instead, what we have in the marketplace is people like Podia and so on, who are selling us the idea of the weak image, which indeed depends on reading the mass media, television, and so on, which prompt people like Eisenman, for example, in another lecture last week, to focus on what he called weak image and to really to work out his own concept from what he takes for granted as an existing situation, as a kind of common ground. Now, I think this is really where the debate now can, should be, and perhaps some extent does take place. The fact that we go back, I think, is an inevitable attempt to surmount the obstacle, which is to understand the whole movement. The whole movement, in that case, I mean, with due respect, I mean, I find the Valhalla project interesting, but slightly, to my mind, slightly not in the center of the situation, because indeed, it meant that we went into smaller issues, rather reflected from the key problem at the time, which is exemplified. You refer to Zemper, and indeed Zemper came back with Plechnik. It was Zemper where we could see that from an analysis of national, or what connected with ethnic origin, trying to establish the first time what some people call materialist analysis of style. But what he really tried, materialist or not, he tried to establish styles on a different footing than ethnic, cultural, relative, and tried to establish another kind of thing. But this is the kind of thing which led him to the idea of the cladding, the idea of the ornament, and so on. Now, this project has somehow lost its steam, and I suggest again that it lost its steam because it leads to results that are uncomfortable in the immediate distance, in the immediate right now. But perhaps this is what one should focus on.
But aren't you falling into the trap that you're setting up for your as your critique by you're in fact invoking by your priority that there is a higher order of things using a kind of your rational criteria, this is what we should be doing. And that in fact tends to lose some of the richness of the argument. So I mean cannot necessarily assign, I don't think, that kind of priority if one actually wants to notice what is happening historically. If one does assign things in that way, one actually misses out quite a lot. On the other hand, I don't see any particular reason why we shouldn't, in fact, try to build this into the bigger enterprise. But I think we can learn a lot from from some of the by parts, even if we assign them as such. Well, I think the Valhalla does do quite a lot. It raises a lot of issues.
No, I want to say that this is not the part of what is of interest to us, but I'm thinking in terms of the movement. That was not the kind of thing. I mean, I just refer to the contrast with Semper, which inaugurated something that went on. Whereas I think in the Valhalla case, we should have been able to discuss the influence of Wagner, which is again leads you to a completely different kind of debate.
Okay, there's an intervention.
I think what Ludo was saying, something about I was trying to understand and also to see what can make this connection.
Speak a bit louder.
You were saying something about the idea of the project and the enlightenment, which is in a way towards some kind of universality, which is what everybody is seeking. And on the other hand, there is this thing of we like the whole and the origin. And I think this is part of the problem, because there's these two tendencies. But in there's another way of looking at it, and that is that the origin is also the goal. In other words, the future and the past are not linear, time-bound sort of formulation of conceptual formulations, but that the origin and the goal are identified, and that therefore it's whichever end you start, you're bound to arrive at the other. So if you end up by sort of discussing the home, or discussing the homebound or the vernacular, you eventually, if it is a living tradition, you will eventually arrive at something which is much more and beyond the home, because that which defines a particular identity is both that which expresses it and links it with other identities. So it goes to what you were saying before in the beginning.
I'm not going to defend Valhalla, but to try to trace the question. But in my view, no architect came to the idea to express national ideas for architecture before the last decades of the 18th century. So it is a quite new problem, the problem of nationality in architecture. The way in which this was attempted was a straightforward one, which means it was an attempt to find out convenient iconographies to express national ideas. We can trace this line of nationality in architecture to the whole 19th and also the 20th century, at least since the Second World War. And I think that it is a history of failures. It's a history which reveals a dilemma and also a drama which is very closely linked with the drama of modernity itself. The drama is expressed by the fact that architecture needs the help of other disciplines of discourse in order to make clear its aims as an expression of national idea. That's the point where the failure is focused. But there is another set of problems with nationality. I could put it as a sort of question, whether there are implicit, not explicit as the first ones, implicit national qualities in architecture. To make it more clear, I would like to refer to Rice's remarks, for example, on the question of theory, of the non-existence of explicit theories in British architecture, for example, and the existence of explicit theories in continental architecture, for example. Or to the other matter we raised in the conference about nationalism and empiricism some years ago, the distinction between the British and the continental conditions. Or the way Pevsner, for example, puts the problem with Englishness of English art. Or to go a bit further, whether the Lloyds of London is interpretation, a rather decorative interpretation, new interpretation of Gothic in terms of not very high technology. Which means whether there are between the different national contexts non-simultaneities, which could establish national differences between
Okay, there.
I'd like to make a quick point. I didn't listen to the first day's presentations, but I hope that there will be more presentations outside the European context. If there were presentations of the United States or, in fact, non-European countries, I think the whole discussion could be a much richer discussion. Because in some ways I agree with Roy's presentation, if I understood it correctly, the meaning of these terms and the way we associate, correlate certain buildings or certain architects as international or national is an aside. Well, you used a different word, not aside, but yes, denominated. And for example, I will give one example outside the European context. Outside the European context, there's a lot of nationalism going on at the moment, and some people refer to them, but tangentially, in order to defend view of nationalism, rather than discussing nationalism in those countries at the moment, which I think present a very complex phenomenon. For the non-European, international and national both belong to Europe. At the moment, the nationalism going on at the non-European countries are, I think, a reflection of intellectual discussions in Europe, just like internationalism was reflected in those countries. And I can extend it to the architectural issues as well. But in practice, I think when these things become isms, I think the title of the conference was very interesting. It wasn't internationalism and nationalism, because I think there's a difference between international national values in architecture and internationalism and nationalism in architecture, because from the ideological level to the practice of architecture, there is a shift, I think. And I will again give examples from the non-European countries. I think at the ideological level, I believe that a lot of those ideas about nationalism or national come from the European intellectualism. Because, as mentioned many times by colleagues, there is access to media, ideas are distributed much quicker than they did before. A lot of these people come to Europe to be educated, to practice. But when they go back to their countries, I think the definition of an ism becomes a problem. Here I will introduce something else. I think most of nationalism is defined as a style. It becomes a style in other words. I think at the level of international, national, there can be common denominators between its European interpretation or non-European interpretation. But in its practice as architecture, there are a lot of differences. Because first of all, as an ism in those countries, people know, architects know what to reject. Because the rules of internationalism as an ism are set and they are practiced. And the discontent, in other words, nationalism at the moment as a style is defined partly by the negation of internationalism. Whatever people were unhappy about, or whatever is blamed in internationalism, somehow gets into the definition of nationalism in those countries. And second, it is at the ideological level, or the reflection of the ideological level, is looking for roots. The problem starts in defining nationalism, not in defining what it is not, but in defining what it is. Because when those countries try to define what it is very difficult to look into the past. And which past? Because there are endless layers of past architecture. And in some countries, I can give examples, they ignore certain layers completely, depending on the political trend. For example, in Turkey, for example, what is called the first nationalist architectural movement was intentionally, originally, pan-Islamic. Although, in reflections in architecture, the Ottoman architecture had absolutely very little to do with Islamic architecture. So the references were to Islamic in the sense that that architecture was practiced elsewhere, but not in the Ottoman sense. But later on it became rejecting the Ottoman past, again looking into the past, that was in the 1930s, but ignoring the Ottoman past because the independence war was against the Ottomans, so they had to ignore that past completely as belonging to the new nation. But they had to look into the very early civilizations which lived in Anatolia, to the Hittites, to the Seljuks, which had very little to do with the current architecture. But the ideological links and the political links had to be made with that past rather than other layers which mixed with those and created other things. And the third generation of nationalism is looking at completely different things. So it's each definition and interpretation as an ism, as a style. I think it takes a different form, although the principles of it as international, national, might be similar.
I mean, I think that there are many important things in what you said. I mean, firstly, that you confront directly a problem, which is that, in a sense, the concept of nation, the idea that there is one nation and other nations around it, is born out of a peculiarly European experience, historical experience, which has really very little to do with the rest of the planet and its history, even though those now may be formally, for the purposes of the United Nations or whatever, be organized like as nations, even though they may well be the product of a certain kind of nationalism. That does not mean that they're kind of objects which are similar to what is normally called a European nation. Although, of course, in turn, that then means that the very concept of a European nation needs to be kind of reconsidered, like in terms of what are the points of identification. I think the second thing that you said, which is also very important, is that somehow we've used the word kind of nation always, and it's because it always happens, that whatever is national is something which comes from the past. I mean, hence, as it were, although we've said like nationality, the idea of a national form or whatever, it might be thought to exist, it always has to be invented. It's invented, almost the solidity with which it's thought to exist is because it's always presented as having already existed. I mean, in that sense, in the 20th century, almost all ideologies of architecture or whatever will use at a certain point the past as the dimension in which legitimacy occurs. Seems to me that ought to be fairly relentlessly contested. It's actually, if you turn the whole point round, it is really very extraordinary that there's never been a nationalism which defines its point of identification in the future. It may well be that political movements like socialism have. It may be that, as it were, some forms of nationalism are predicated on a future event, such as independence. But the independence really is, in some sense, a recognition of what has always been there, the nation. I can think of no national argument for like a national style or whatever which has ever taken its point of reference in the future. I think it would actually be impossible.
But no product, which is a projection of the next 1,000 years.
Yeah, but it's about re-establishing a purity that should never have been lost, which I think is the matrix of those.
The 1,000-year Reich, I mean, comes precisely from Barbarossa's notion. I mean, it is the very idea of the 1,000-year Reich is one which kind of flows underneath a whole lot of medieval philosophy, which is being deliberately exploited.
It's the last coming, the third coming, the second coming.
Exactly. It belongs to medieval eschatological thought.
Future or
No. I mean, only in terms of its kind of linguistic reference, not in terms of its affect.
I think your argument is not that there is no past, that they cannot be without the past. It can have a future, but it has to have a past. And the National Socialism is precisely, its force came from this combination. It had a future, and it talks in the futuristic terms, and just like the futurists themselves, but it used the past, unlike the futurists.
Well, I don't understand that. I mean, what could be more archaic than the kind of imagery
Much
of
too
the
simple.
Third Reich?
I mean, the whole force of the National Socialism was precisely that it was a force that was able to embrace, I would say, even modernism, even with an ism, with its past. That's a force of its argument.
But the legitimacy comes from the past.
About the Orthodox.
Sorry?
Yes.
About the Orthodox.
combined with the technology obsession of the Nazis.
Sorry, I mean, I'm not making the point that regimes or whatever aren't concerned with what is conventionally politically called the future. After all nationalisms look forward to a point at which something will happen. But what will happen is an act of recognition. And the Third Reich employs that as well. That what the future is precisely the point of recognition which has been there since time immemorial. There are two pasts within National Socialism. There's like a sort of, folkish past in the woods. And for more theoretically minded SS, there's a kind of, Greek pantheism. But they're both pasts.
Anyway, I think we're going to have to close our meeting now. I think that rhetoric does very nicely even now. In fact, probably seems to be one of the most memorable things that people still talk about in terms of Mussolini's Italy was that the trains ran on time. So I just say that, for Julian, who's not listening, but it doesn't matter. Thank you all very, very much. I think we've had an extremely interesting set of contributions, and I think we've had a very, very, very good conference. And I thank you all enormously for coming, and I certainly hope that we will continue to run events of this sort, and we certainly will have recorded all the presentations that have been given, and we do have a sort of complete record of the event. So we haven't quite decided the future of the event, but we certainly have got the record for ourselves and for anybody who is interested. Well, thank you very much indeed. Thank you.